The sun had barely begun to rise over the historic palace, casting a soft golden light over the cobblestone streets. This was a place where history stood still, where every stone and every building told a story of centuries past. The royal guard stood in silence, a perfect embodiment of strength and tradition, watching over the gates of the palace like statues. Among them was Alexander, a young man with a strong jawline and eyes that seemed to have witnessed the passing of time. His posture was impeccable. Every day, for hours on end, he would stand still, his uniform crisp and spotless. He was a royal guard, one of the most respected positions in the country. It was a job that demanded precision, unwavering focus, and above all, patience. But there was more to it than just standing still in front of the palace gates. Alexander had joined the royal guard as a young man eager to serve his country. His family was proud, and so was he. His father had served in the military, and his grandfather had been a part of the royal security. For Alexander, it was more than just a job. It was a tradition, a responsibility passed down through generations. Every time he put on the uniform, it wasn't just about protecting the palace or the monarchy. It was about honoring the legacy of those who had done it before him. The royal guards were known not just for their strict discipline, but also for their unwavering calm in the face of all kinds of distractions. The tourists who visited the palace were often fascinated by the guards. Some would stare at them in wonder, while others would try to get closer for a better look, some even taking pictures. But no matter what happened, no matter how loud or close the tourists came, the guards were trained to stay still, their faces blank, their eyes forward. They had one job: to stand guard, to protect, and to not show a hint of emotion. For Alexander, this wasn't always easy. He had seen it all: the curious stares, the excited crowds, and sometimes the more mischievous tourists who tried to get a reaction. There were those who thought it was funny to step too close, to take photos without asking, or to make silly faces in front of him. The tourists would often laugh, trying to get a glimpse of any kind of reaction. But there was nothing. Alexander was an expert in staying still, in not moving, and in not responding. It wasn't just about the physical discipline of standing perfectly still. It was also about mental discipline. The royal guard had to ignore the noise, the movement, the distractions all around them. Tourists often thought it was funny to test the guards' patience, to see if they could make them smile or flinch. They would push the limits, getting closer, even trying to provoke a response. But Alexander and his fellow guards were trained to ignore it. Their job wasn't to entertain. It was to protect the history and tradition of the monarchy, something that was far more important than any momentary amusement. But standing in front of the palace wasn't just about standing still. It was about something deeper. Alexander understood that he wasn't just representing himself or his uniform. He was representing centuries of tradition, a symbol of his country's heritage and dignity. People came from all over the world to see the palace and its guards. To them, the royal guard wasn't just a man in a uniform. It was a living symbol of the nation's history. This was something Alexander carried with him every day. Every guard had their own story, their own reasons for joining. But they all shared one thing in common: a sense of duty. Alexander remembered the day he was chosen to be a part of the royal guard. It was a proud moment for him and his family. When he first stood in front of the palace gates in his uniform, he felt a rush of honor and responsibility. It wasn't just about wearing the uniform. It was about what the uniform represented. It was about being part of something bigger than himself. The days were long. The hours of standing still could sometimes feel like an eternity. But the discipline was something Alexander had grown used to. It was like breathing, something he didn't even have to think about. But as the days passed, he began to notice something else. The tourists seemed more curious, more excited, and in some cases a bit more bold. He often caught glimpses of them: families with children, couples snapping pictures, groups of friends laughing. Most were respectful, quietly observing the guards or simply admiring the beauty of the palace. But there were always a few who couldn't seem to resist the urge to break the silence, to get closer, to test the limits. Alexander had learned to tune out the noise and keep his focus. But every now and then a certain tourist would stand out. One day it happened again. A group of tourists approached the palace gates, their cameras ready, eager to capture the perfect shot. Some of them were already taking pictures, while others chatted excitedly amongst themselves. But in the crowd there was one tourist who caught Alexander's eye. He was a tall man, laughing loudly, dressed in bright clothing that contrasted sharply with the formal uniform of the guard. He seemed oblivious to the solemnity of the moment. The man raised his phone, aiming it directly at Alexander's face. He waved his hand in front of the guard, trying to provoke a reaction. Alexander stood perfectly still, his eyes focused ahead, not acknowledging the man in any way. The tourist grew bolder. He stepped closer, invading the guard's personal space. This was no longer about taking a photo. It had become a challenge. The tourist grinned, hoping for some sign, any sign that Alexander would crack. But Alexander did nothing. He couldn't. It was against everything he had been taught. It was in his training to not react. Every day he practiced this. Every day he learned to resist the urge to move, to speak, or to let the distractions get to him. The tourist kept pushing, not understanding the sacredness of the moment and, most importantly, the respect that was due to the royal guard. The longer the man stood there, the more the crowd began to notice. It was no longer just one tourist bothering the guard. Others were starting to laugh, whispering to each other about what was happening. Some of them found it funny, but others, those who truly understood the significance of the royal guard, were starting to feel uncomfortable. Alexander kept his gaze straight ahead, not allowing himself to be drawn into the drama. But inside he felt a twinge of frustration. This wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented. The history, the tradition, the dignity of the monarchy. And yet here was a tourist treating it like a joke. Despite the situation, Alexander reminded himself that he had a job to do. No matter how loud or disrespectful the tourist became, he was a symbol of something bigger. He would stand his ground, as all the royal guards had before him. It wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting a bright, cheerful light across the scene at the palace gates. The crowds were growing larger, and the tourists were becoming more excited. Some of them were taking pictures of the beautiful architecture, while others wandered around chatting with their friends and family. But in the middle of this group, there was one tourist who stood out from the rest. He was loud, brash, and seemed completely unaware of the surroundings or the rules that governed them. Alexander, standing tall and silent, was used to these crowds by now. Most of the time, tourists respected the royal guard's role. They would stand back, admire the uniform, and quietly snap their pictures. Some even whispered in awe at how composed the guards were, how they could remain perfectly still for hours without a hint of movement. But today was different. Today, it wasn't the quiet admiration of the usual tourists. It was the disruptive behavior of one individual who seemed to think that the guard's duty was there for his amusement. The man was wearing a bright, colorful shirt and a pair of oversized sunglasses, completely out of place among the dignified surroundings of the palace. He walked with a swagger as if he was the center of attention, loudly chatting with his friends. As he approached Alexander, he seemed to notice the guard's perfect stillness and saw an opportunity to have some fun. With a mischievous grin, the tourist raised his phone and aimed it directly at Alexander. He stepped closer, his camera held out like a weapon, hoping to get the perfect shot. But it wasn't just about the picture. It was clear that the man was trying to get a reaction. He started waving his hand in front of Alexander's face, moving the camera up and down as if testing how long the guard could hold his position. "Hey, come on, smile," the tourist called out, laughing. "You look so serious. Aren't you supposed to be having fun? This is a royal guard, right? You're not a robot, are you?" The laughter of his friends echoed around as they too began to watch the scene unfold. Most of the people around seemed confused by the man's behavior, unsure of how to react. Some looked away, embarrassed for him, while others stood frozen, unsure whether they should step in. But Alexander didn't move. He didn't even blink. He remained as still as stone, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his posture as perfect as it had been since the moment he stood guard that morning. His silence was like a wall, an invisible barrier that the tourist couldn't break. The man, however, seemed determined. He stepped even closer, now just inches away from Alexander. "I'm sure you're not that boring, right? Just one little smile, come on. It'll make my day," he said with an exaggerated tone. The more he spoke, the louder he got, as though he were daring Alexander to respond. The crowd around them began to shift, some people taking out their phones to record the moment. They were waiting, anticipating a reaction. The tourists, as if in some sort of strange contest, wanted to see if they could provoke the guard into breaking his stillness. They had heard rumors about the royal guards being able to withstand anything, but surely no one could hold out forever under such pressure. Alexander could feel the tension building around him. He heard the voices, felt the eyes on him, but still he did nothing. He couldn't. It wasn't just his training that kept him still. It was his sense of duty, of respect for the role he played in the history of the monarchy. He knew that he wasn't just standing there as a person. He was a part of something much bigger than himself, something that had stood the test of time. But even as he kept his composure, the frustration inside him began to grow. This was no longer about maintaining his own discipline. This was about what he represented. The Royal Guard was a symbol of the country's heritage, of tradition and respect. To have someone treat it like a joke, to have a tourist walk right up to him and taunt him, it was disrespectful. But Alexander held firm. He had been trained for moments like this when people would test his patience, his dignity, and his resolve. The tourist, seeing no change in the guard's expression, took it as a challenge. "Come on, man, I'm just trying to have a little fun here," he said, a bit louder now. "You're so serious all the time. What's the point of this job if you can't even smile once?" By now, more people had gathered, and the scene had started to feel uncomfortable. Some tourists were now murmuring among themselves, not understanding why the guard wasn't reacting. A few began to speak up, telling the man to leave Alexander alone, but the loud tourist paid no attention to them. He was too caught up in his own amusement to realize that his actions were causing a disruption. One of the tourists, an elderly woman who had been observing the scene quietly, turned to her husband. "He's just a boy standing there doing his job," she whispered. "Why can't they see that? Why make fun of him?" Her husband nodded, clearly upset, but said nothing. He knew how disrespectful some tourists could be, but there wasn't much he could do. He wasn't in charge. All they could do was watch, hoping that someone, anyone, would step in to stop the situation before it got worse. But it wasn't just the tourists that Alexander had to deal with. It was the expectations placed upon him by his training, by the history he represented. He couldn't lose control. He couldn't let the provocation get to him, no matter how badly he wanted to respond. To tell the tourist that his behavior wasn't just funny, it was deeply disrespectful. He had to keep the peace to maintain the image of the Royal Guard no matter what. As the minutes dragged on, the tourist began to grow frustrated. His friends, too, had started to lose interest, but not before snapping a few more pictures, hoping to capture the guard's reaction. The man finally stepped back, sighing loudly and shaking his head. "Well, that was boring," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "You'd think he'd lighten up a little. Guess some people take their jobs way too seriously." The crowd began to disperse as the moment passed. Some still glanced at Alexander, some of them even offering sympathetic smiles. The tourists who had been excited to see the Royal Guard now seemed embarrassed, realizing that they had crossed a line, even if they hadn't meant to. But Alexander didn't notice. His focus remained unbroken, his face as still and calm as ever. His job wasn't to engage with the tourists, to smile or entertain. His job was to be a symbol of honor and tradition, to stand guard over the history of his country. He had done that, as he always did, without so much as a flicker of emotion. As the group of tourists finally walked away, the air around the palace gates began to return to normal. The crowds, which had once been buzzing with excitement, began to quiet down. Alexander's resolve, as unwavering as ever, remained the same. He had passed the test, unmoved, undisturbed, and steadfast. The situation had started to feel like something out of a bad dream. The morning sun was now high in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of the palace courtyard. People continued to move about, some still snapping photos of the beautiful architecture, others wandering aimlessly, lost in their own world. But in the midst of all the chatter, one scene had become the center of attention. Alexander, the Royal Guard, who had been stoically standing at his post, completely unfazed by the noise and the distractions. And then there was the tourist still pushing the limits, still trying to get under Alexander's skin. After several minutes of trying to provoke a reaction from the guard, the loud tourist, now growing increasingly frustrated, seemed to think that if he pushed just a little harder, he would finally get the result he wanted. His voice grew louder and his gestures became more exaggerated. Come on, you're supposed to be some kind of statue, huh? Well, I can see that I've got you cornered now. You're not so tough after all. The crowd of onlookers was silent, watching in tense anticipation. They all seemed to realize that something was different now. It wasn't just a tourist trying to make light of the situation. It was a deliberate challenge, a test of patience that had gone too far. The other tourists were starting to feel uncomfortable, noticing the tension between the loud tourist and the guard. They began to murmur among themselves, unsure whether to step in or simply watch the spectacle unfold. The more the tourist taunted Alexander, the more the atmosphere began to shift. It wasn't just about the guard anymore, it was about what this moment represented. For Alexander, it wasn't just a job. It was a duty to uphold the respect and honor of his country's traditions, but the loud tourist was making that job incredibly difficult. Alexander's eyes remained focused ahead, unblinking, his posture perfect. He could feel his blood begin to boil. It wasn't anger, it was frustration. Frustration with the disrespectful behavior that had been building all morning. Frustration with the fact that his duty was being tested, that his ability to maintain calm was being pushed to its limit. And then, in an unexpected move, something inside Alexander shifted. The anger, the frustration, it all came together in a single, undeniable moment. He took a step forward. The sound of his boots clicking against the stone ground seemed to echo through the courtyard, silencing the crowd around him. For a brief second, the tourist looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected the guard to move. After all, it was practically unheard of for a royal guard to break their stillness. But Alexander had had enough. His eyes met the tourist's, and in that moment he didn't look like just a guard. He didn't look like a soldier simply doing his duty. No, in that moment he was a man standing up for something much bigger. He was a symbol of respect, of honor, and of tradition. And he wasn't going to let anyone disrespect that. Enough, Alexander said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it had power in it. The crowd around them froze, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The tourist, who had been so bold only moments before, took a step back, a nervous look crossing his face. He had never expected the guard to speak, let alone take a step toward him. The man with the phone lowered his camera, his cocky grin faltering. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the guard to actually say something, let alone move. For the first time, he realized that the guard wasn't someone to be toyed with. This wasn't just a game. This was serious. Alexander's eyes never wavered from the tourist's face. "You've crossed the line," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "This is not a joke. This is not a performance for your entertainment. I am here to uphold tradition, to represent the dignity of my country, and I ask you respectfully to step back." The crowd around them was silent. People exchanged glances, some looking at the tourist in disbelief, others in awe of how composed Alexander had been throughout the entire ordeal. Some began to murmur, talking quietly among themselves, expressing their admiration for the royal guard's composure and strength. They were witnessing something rare, something most tourists had never seen. A royal guard breaking his silence, standing up for what was right, all while maintaining his professionalism and respect. The loud tourist seemed to shrink back. His bravado was gone, replaced with a nervous energy he hadn't expected. He shifted on his feet, suddenly unsure of himself. I didn't mean to cause trouble," he stammered. "I was just trying to have a little fun." But Alexander wasn't done. He wasn't angry, but his voice was firm and unyielding. "It's not fun to disrespect the traditions of this place," he said. "It's not fun to mock those who are here to protect and honor it. If you cannot show respect, then you should leave." The man nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment. Without saying another word, he turned and walked away, his friends trailing behind him, awkwardly looking back at the royal guard. The rest of the crowd, still quiet, watched them go, some shaking their heads, some even exchanging quiet words of approval for the way Alexander had handled the situation. As the tourist left, the air around the palace gates seemed to relax. The tension that had filled the air moments earlier started to dissipate. The crowd, which had been so eager to watch the spectacle, seemed to come to a collective realization. This wasn't something to be entertained by. The royal guard wasn't there to entertain anyone. They were there to uphold something much more important. Alexander took a deep breath, letting the frustration of the moment pass. He returned to his original position, standing tall, his back straight, his gaze fixed ahead. The other guards nearby, who had witnessed the scene unfold, remained stoic as ever, but there was a slight nod of respect between them. They had all seen how the situation could have escalated. They knew how hard it could be to maintain composure under such pressure. But Alexander had done it. He had stood his ground. And in that moment, something changed. Not just for Alexander, but for those who had witnessed it. The tourists, the bystanders, the crowd. They all saw the royal guard in a different light. They saw the strength, the dedication, and the grace it took to uphold such a role. They saw the respect that was due, not just to the uniform, but to the tradition, to the history, and to the duty of the men and women who wore it. For Alexander, this was just another day on the job. But for everyone else, it was a moment they would remember. An unforgettable display of dignity and strength. A reminder that respect and tradition should never be taken lightly.